What security footage did my brother-in-law show everyone at Christmas dinner? Keith walked into the dining room carrying his laptop instead of the dessert plates my wife Stephanie had asked him to bring from the kitchen. 22 family members sat around the extended table my father-in-law had assembled from 3 separate tables pushed together, covered with matching red tablecloths. We'd just finished the main course, and my mother-in-law was about to serve her famous pecan pie when Keith set the laptop down in the middle of the table, right on top of the centerpiece. My wife's face went pale immediately, which struck me as odd because I had no idea what was on that computer, but apparently she did. Keith looked around the table at all of us, his jaw set in a way I'd never seen before. He was normally the easygoing brother-in-law who cracked jokes and kept family gatherings light. Now he looked like someone who'd been carrying a terrible weight for months. "Before we have dessert, there's something everyone needs to see," he said, his voice steady but cold. Stephanie stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "Keith, whatever you think you're doing, this isn't the time or place." Keith turned to face her directly. "Actually, this is exactly the time and place. Everyone who's been defending you, everyone who's been making excuses, everyone who thinks I'm crazy, they all need to see this together." My father-in-law, Robert, held up his hand in that authoritative way he had from 30 years of managing corporate offices. "Keith, son, I don't know what's going on between you and Stephanie, but Christmas dinner with the whole family present isn't the venue for airing grievances." Keith's wife, Vanessa, Stephanie's younger sister, sat beside him looking torn between supporting her husband and maintaining family peace. She'd been quiet all evening, barely touching her food, and now I understood why. She knew what was coming. Keith opened the laptop and turned it so the screen faced the majority of the table. "This is security footage from my mother's bedroom," he said. Several relatives immediately objected, saying they didn't want to see anything from someone's bedroom, but Keith cut them off. "It's not what you think. My mother is 83 years old and has advanced dementia. 6 months ago, I installed hidden cameras in her room at the memory care facility because items kept going missing. Jewelry, cash, family heirlooms. The staff kept saying dementia patients misplace things, that it was probably other residents wandering into rooms, but I knew something else was happening." The room went completely silent. Keith pressed play, and we all watched as the timestamp showed a date from 4 months ago, early morning. The camera had a clear view of the entire room, including a dresser where an elderly woman who I recognized as Keith's mother sat in her wheelchair by the window. The door opened, and Stephanie walked in wearing her blue scrubs from the healthcare agency, where she worked as a visiting nurse. I felt my stomach drop, even though I didn't yet know what I was about to see. Stephanie appeared on the screen, looking around the room carefully before approaching the dresser. She opened the top drawer and pulled out a small jewelry box. She looked through it methodically, selecting several pieces and slipping them into her pocket. Then she moved to the closet, going through coat pockets and purses hanging on hooks. She found what looked like a wallet, removed cash from it, and put the wallet back. The whole process took maybe 3 minutes. Mrs. Whitmore, Keith's mother, sat in her wheelchair completely unaware, looking out the window at nothing in particular. When Stephanie finished, she walked over to Mrs. Whitmore, adjusted her blanket with apparent tenderness, said something we couldn't hear, and kissed her forehead before leaving. "That's not the only footage," Keith said, his voice shaking slightly now. "I have 17 separate videos over 3 months showing her stealing from my mother, but it gets worse." He pulled up another file, this one from a different camera with a different timestamp and different room. After I found the first videos, I reached out to other families at the care facility whose relatives were assigned to Stephanie through the home health agency. 3 of them agreed to install cameras. This is footage from Ronald Murphy's room 2 months ago. The new video showed Stephanie entering an elderly man's room while he slept in his bed. She went through his nightstand drawers, his dresser, even his bathroom cabinets. She took medication bottles, which Keith explained were prescription painkillers that had street value. She took cash from a wallet. She took a watch from the nightstand. Ronald Murphy never woke up during any of it. My hands had started shaking. This was my wife on these videos, the woman I'd been married to for 7 years, the woman who came home every night talking about how rewarding her job was, how much she cared about her elderly patients, how fulfilling it was to help people in their most vulnerable years. Stephanie had backed away from the table, standing now against the wall with her arms crossed. You had no right to record me without my knowledge. That's illegal. Those videos won't hold up in court. Keith smiled without any warmth. Actually, I checked with 3 different lawyers. Security cameras in private residences to protect vulnerable adults from theft are completely legal, and you're about to find out just how well they hold up. He pulled up a document on the screen, some kind of official letterhead. This is a report from a private investigator I hired after I had the first batch of videos. He tracked your movements for 6 weeks, documented every home you visited through the healthcare agency, and cross-referenced them with police reports filed by families about missing items. Want to guess how many matches he found? Vanessa spoke for the first time, her voice barely above a whisper. 41 families, Keith. Tell them the full number. My father-in-law's face had gone from annoyed to shocked to something approaching horror. My mother-in-law had her hand over her mouth. Stephanie's brother, Jeremy, who'd been silent until now, stood up and pointed at Keith. This is absolutely insane. You're trying to destroy Stephanie's reputation based on some grainy videos that could be misinterpreted. Keith pulled up another video, and another, and another. Each one showed Stephanie in a different elderly person's home or room, systematically stealing items. In some videos, the victims were asleep. In others, they were awake, but confused, and Stephanie would engage them in conversation while simultaneously going through their belongings with practiced ease. In one particularly disturbing clip, an elderly woman asked Stephanie directly if she'd seen her wedding ring, and Stephanie helped her look for it while the ring was already in Stephanie's pocket, visible for just a moment when she bent down to check under the bed. The private investigator estimates, based on the items documented as stolen and their approximate values, that Stephanie has stolen somewhere between $200,000 and $300,000 worth of property and cash over the past 4 years, Keith said. That's not even counting the medications she's been taking and presumably selling. The investigator found evidence of her meeting with known prescription drug dealers in parking lots 3 times in the past 2 months. I couldn't process what I was hearing. $300,000, 4 years. That meant this had been happening for most of our marriage. I thought we'd been struggling financially because my salary as a middle school teacher wasn't enough and Stephanie's nursing pay was modest. We talked about cutting expenses, about me taking summer jobs, about postponing having children until we were more stable. And the entire time, she'd been sitting on hundreds of thousands of dollars stolen from elderly people with dementia. Where's the money? I asked, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. Stephanie's eyes snapped to me, and I saw something I'd never seen before. Not shame, not remorse, but calculation. She was trying to figure out what to say, how to spin this in a way that would minimize the damage. David, I can explain everything. It's not what it looks like. Keith laughed, a harsh sound. It's exactly what it looks like. I've already turned all the evidence over to the police and the state nursing board. They've been investigating for the past month. I wanted to wait until they were ready to move forward before showing the family, so no one could tip you off or help you destroy evidence. Robert stood up, his face red. Keith, I appreciate your concern for your mother, but going to the police before even talking to family about this is extreme. Keith's expression hardened. Extreme. Your daughter has been systematically robbing elderly people with dementia for years. She stole my mother's wedding ring, the one she wore for 60 years, the one my father placed on her finger 2 months before he shipped out to Vietnam. She stole a pocket watch that belonged to Ronald Murphy's grandfather, a Civil War veteran. She stole medication from people in pain, leaving them to suffer while she profited. She stole cash from people who needed it to pay for their care. And you think I'm being extreme? Vanessa reached for Keith's hand. We tried to handle this quietly at first. Keith confronted Stephanie privately 2 months ago, before he went to the police. He showed her the evidence and gave her a chance to confess, return what she'd stolen, and turn herself in. She threatened to destroy our marriage, told Keith she'd tell everyone he was abusing her, that he'd fabricated the videos. She said she'd ruin his career, make sure he never saw our kids again. That's when we knew she wasn't going to stop on her own. I stared at Stephanie, this person I thought I knew, trying to find any trace of the woman I'd married. Is any of this true? Did you actually threaten them? Stephanie's face twisted into something ugly. They ambushed me with edited videos and expected me to just confess to crimes I didn't commit. Keith has hated me since Vanessa and I had that argument 3 years ago about their parenting. This is revenge, David. He's manufacturing evidence to destroy me because I called out how he treats their kids. Keith pulled up his phone and played an audio recording. Stephanie's voice came through clearly. You want to play this game, Keith? I've been documenting every argument you and Vanessa have. Every time you lose your temper with the kids, every time you drink too much at family events. I'll bury you in CPS complaints. Tell them you hit your son, that you're unstable. By the time I'm done, you'll be lucky if you get supervised visitation. And David will back me up because he trusts me. The voice was unmistakably hers. I'd heard that exact tone before, usually when she was on the phone with her mother dealing with family drama, but never directed at me or about me. That recording was made during the conversation where I confronted her, Keith said. I recorded it because I suspected she'd try to twist what happened, and I was right. She spent the next week telling Vanessa that I'd attacked her, that I'd made up lies about her stealing. My mother-in-law, Patricia, was crying now, and several other family members looked shell-shocked. Jeremy had sat back down but was staring at Stephanie with an expression of betrayal. Stephanie's Aunt Linda, who'd helped pay for Stephanie's nursing school, stood up and walked out of the room without a word. Robert looked between Keith and Stephanie, seemingly trying to determine who to believe. Stephanie, these are serious accusations. If there's any explanation, any context we're missing, now is the time to share it. Stephanie straightened, and I watched her slip into the persona she used when she needed to be persuasive. Her voice softened, her posture changed to something vulnerable. Daddy, I'm not going to lie. I did take some items from patients' homes, but not for the reasons Keith is implying. These were items the families were throwing away. Things the patients didn't even remember they had. I was planning to sell them and donate the money to the Alzheimer's Research Foundation. I have documentation of donations I've made. Keith immediately pulled up more files on his laptop. These are bank statements I subpoenaed through my lawyer as part of a civil suit I filed last month. 0 donations to any Alzheimer's organizations. 0 donations to any charitable organizations at all. But I can show you deposits into a separate account. Significant deposits totaling over $270,000 over 4 years. An account David doesn't know about. He turned the laptop to show banking records with Stephanie's name on them. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. $270,000. An account I'd never heard of while we'd been eating rice and beans for dinner 3 nights a week because I thought we were broke. The police have already frozen that account as proceeds from criminal activity, Keith continued. They've also executed a search warrant on your house this afternoon while everyone was here. I'm sorry, David, but you're probably going to come home to find your place torn apart. They were looking for stolen items, additional records, anything that might be evidence. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. I just sat there trying to understand how my entire life had been a lie. Stephanie had been stealing from elderly people with dementia, accumulating hundreds of thousands of dollars, and I'd had no idea. What did that say about me? How had I not seen any signs? Robert's phone rang, and he stepped away from the table to answer it. We could hear his side of the conversation, his voice growing increasingly agitated. When he came back, his face was ashen. That was Detective Lawrence from the county sheriff's office. He wanted to inform the family that they're preparing to arrest Stephanie tonight. They're giving her the opportunity to turn herself in voluntarily rather than being taken into custody here, in front of everyone. Stephanie's composure finally cracked. She grabbed her purse and headed for the door, but Keith stood up and blocked her path. The detective is waiting outside. He wanted to give you dignity, but he's not letting you run. I heard Stephanie's voice rise to a pitch I'd never heard before. This is entrapment. You set me up. You coordinated with the police to humiliate me in front of my entire family. I'll sue every single person involved in this. Keith stepped aside and gestured to the door. Feel free to try. My lawyers are very confident about our position. 2 detectives entered the dining room, and the surreal nature of the situation intensified. One was a woman in her 50s who introduced herself as Detective Lawrence, and the other was a younger man who stayed by the door. Detective Lawrence addressed Stephanie directly, but not unkindly. Ms. Foster, I'm here to place you under arrest for multiple counts of theft from vulnerable adults, elder abuse, and fraud. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in court. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you. Stephanie looked at me then, really looked at me for the first time since Keith had started playing the videos. David, you know me. You know I'm not capable of this. Are you going to stand there and let them arrest me based on Keith's fabricated evidence? Are you going to defend your wife, or believe a man who's had it out for me for years? I wanted to defend her. Part of me still wanted to believe this was all some terrible misunderstanding, that there was an explanation that would make everything make sense. But I'd seen the videos. I'd heard the audio recording. I'd seen the bank statements. I don't know what to believe right now, I said quietly. But I know those videos are real. I know that's you in them. I know you have a secret bank account with hundreds of thousands of dollars that came from somewhere. Stephanie's face hardened again. You're weak. You've always been weak. I thought I could build a life with you, but you're just a small-minded teacher who will never amount to anything. Those people I took from, they didn't even know what they had. They were going to die soon anyway. Their families were just going to fight over the inheritance. I made better use of their resources than they ever would have. The detective exchanged a glance with her partner, and I realized Stephanie had just confessed on tape. The body cameras both officers wore had captured every word. Robert made a sound like he'd been hit. Patricia's crying intensified. Jeremy stood up and left the room, unable to watch anymore. Keith remained standing, his expression a mixture of vindication and sadness. Stephanie was led out in handcuffs, still hurling accusations and threats at Keith, at me, at the detectives. The Christmas tree lights twinkled in the living room, and someone's Christmas playlist was still playing softly in the background. The cognitive dissonance of festive music and arrest proceedings was surreal. After the police left with Stephanie, the family sat in stunned silence for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Robert was the first to speak, his voice rough. Keith, I owe you an apology. I should have trusted that you wouldn't bring something like this to the family without absolute certainty. Keith nodded but didn't look satisfied, just exhausted. I didn't want to be right. I spent 2 months hoping I'd find something that would explain the videos differently, that would prove I'd misunderstood what I was seeing. But every piece of evidence I found just made it worse. Vanessa wrapped her arms around him, and he seemed to deflate slightly, the adrenaline wearing off. Patricia approached me tentatively, her face blotchy from crying. David, I'm so sorry. I can't imagine what you're going through right now. If there's anything we can do to help you through this, anything at all, please tell us. I appreciated the gesture, but I couldn't imagine what help would look like. My wife had just been arrested for stealing from elderly people with dementia. Our house was being searched by police. I'd discovered a secret bank account with money I'd never known existed. My entire marriage had been built on lies. I left the family gathering and drove home, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. The house looked normal from the outside, but when I unlocked the door, I saw what Keith had warned me about. The police had indeed executed their search warrant. Drawers were pulled out, closets emptied, furniture moved. They'd been thorough but not destructive. Everything was simply displaced, waiting to be put back together. I found the search warrant receipt on the kitchen table, listing items they'd taken as evidence. Jewelry, documents, a laptop, several bags of items from the bedroom closet. I walked through each room, trying to identify what was missing, what had been deemed evidence of my wife's crimes. In her office, they'd taken file boxes full of paperwork. In the bedroom, they'd removed several pieces of jewelry I'd never seen her wear. In the garage, they'd taken 2 large plastic storage bins I'd always assumed contained seasonal decorations. I sat on the couch in our torn-apart living room and called my brother in California. He was the only person I could think of who might know what to say or how to help. When he answered, I could hear his kids in the background, the sounds of a normal Christmas evening. David, hey, Merry Christmas. How's the family gathering going? His cheerful tone made everything worse somehow. I started talking and couldn't stop. I told him everything that had happened in the past 3 hours, every detail of the videos Keith had shown, Stephanie's arrest, the search warrant. My brother listened without interrupting, and when I finally ran out of words, he was quiet for a long moment. You need a lawyer, he finally said. Not a criminal defense lawyer for you, but someone who can protect your assets, make sure you're not held liable for anything Stephanie did. The police might try to investigate whether you knew about the thefts or benefited from them. The thought hadn't occurred to me, but he was right. I called a lawyer friend from college who did family law, apologizing for bothering him on Christmas. He listened to my abbreviated version of events and told me to come to his office first thing the next morning. He also advised me to sleep somewhere else that night, suggesting that staying in the house might look bad if the police were watching. I packed a bag and drove to a hotel near the school where I taught. The hotel room was generic and impersonal, which felt appropriate. I lay on the bed, fully clothed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every interaction I'd had with Stephanie over the past 4 years, trying to identify the lies. How many times had she come home with jewelry she'd said was a good deal at an estate sale? How many times had she taken random weekday trips she'd claimed were required training sessions for work? How many times had I believed her completely obvious lies because it never occurred to me that my wife was a criminal? My phone started buzzing with texts from family members, people who'd been at the dinner, and others who'd heard about what happened. Most were supportive, expressing shock and sympathy. A few were from Stephanie's relatives, who seemed to think I should have defended her, that I'd betrayed her by not standing up against Keith's accusations. I turned off my phone and tried to sleep, but couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those videos. Stephanie going through drawers while elderly people slept. Stephanie pocketing jewelry while Mrs. Whitmore stared out the window. Stephanie's face when she'd confessed. That cold certainty that she'd done nothing wrong because her victims were going to die soon anyway. The next morning, I met with the lawyer, Andrew Kirby, who'd cleared space in his holiday schedule to see me. He asked detailed questions about my finances, about what I knew of Stephanie's work, about whether I'd ever seen unexplained items in the house or unusual deposits in our accounts. I answered everything honestly, explaining that our finances had been completely separate at Stephanie's insistence. She'd said it was cleaner that way, that we'd each contribute to household expenses but maintain independence. I'd thought it was a modern approach to marriage. Now I understood it was about hiding her criminal income. Andrew explained that I'd likely need to cooperate fully with the investigation to avoid being charged as an accessory. He recommended I change all passwords, close joint accounts, and file for divorce immediately to protect myself legally and financially. The word divorce felt surreal, but I knew he was right. I couldn't stay married to someone who'd stolen from vulnerable elderly people, regardless of what it meant for my own life. Andrew helped me draft a preliminary separation agreement and started the divorce paperwork. He also connected me with a criminal defense attorney, just in case, and advised me to document everything I remembered about Stephanie's activities and finances. The story broke in the local news 2 days after Christmas. Local nurse arrested for theft from elderly patients. The article included Stephanie's booking photo and outlined the charges against her. It mentioned that investigators believed there were significantly more victims than the 41 families already identified and encouraged anyone who'd employed Stephanie through the home health agency to review their loved ones' belongings for missing items. The comments section exploded with people sharing their own stories of missing items, of suspicions they'd had, of elderly relatives who'd insisted someone was stealing from them but were dismissed as confused. The school district where I taught called me in for a meeting with the principal and superintendent. They were concerned about the media attention and how it might affect my ability to teach effectively. I assured them I was cooperating with police, filing for divorce, and had no knowledge of or involvement in Stephanie's crimes. They seemed satisfied, but put me on notice that any evidence suggesting otherwise would result in immediate termination. I returned to teaching after winter break, feeling like everyone was staring at me, whispering about me, judging me for not knowing what my wife was doing. The preliminary hearing happened in January. I attended, sitting in the back of the courtroom, needing to understand the full scope of what Stephanie had done. The prosecutor presented a summary of the evidence. 63 victims had been identified so far, ranging in age from 74 to 97. The total estimated value of stolen property exceeded $400,000. The prosecutor showed some of the security camera footage Keith had provided, and the judge's expression grew increasingly grim. Stephanie's lawyer argued that the videos were taken without Stephanie's knowledge, that the chain of custody couldn't be verified, that the evidence was circumstantial. The judge wasn't persuaded. He bound Stephanie over for trial on all counts and set bail at $500,000. Robert and Patricia had to mortgage their house to post bail, believing, despite everything, that their daughter deserved the chance to defend herself outside of jail. I'd already filed for divorce, but Stephanie contested it, claiming I owed her spousal support, that my teacher's pension should be split with her, that she deserved half of everything we'd accumulated during the marriage. My lawyer found that darkly funny, given that most of what Stephanie had accumulated was stolen property. The home health agency she'd worked for faced multiple lawsuits from victims' families, alleging negligent hiring and supervision. Internal investigations revealed that several complaints about missing items had been filed against Stephanie over the years, but the agency had never investigated thoroughly, instead rotating her to different facilities and assuming the complaints were unfounded. The agency's insurance company settled most of the suits quickly, not wanting to go to trial with such damaging facts. Stephanie's nursing license was suspended pending the outcome of the criminal case. The state nursing board held its own hearing, presenting evidence that Stephanie had violated virtually every ethical guideline in the profession. Multiple victims' family members testified about the impact of the thefts. One daughter talked about her mother's wedding ring, the only possession she'd wanted after her mother died, which Stephanie had stolen 6 months before the death. Another family described a coin collection worth $80,000 that had taken 3 generations to assemble, now lost because Stephanie had sold it to a dealer who'd melted down the rare coins. Keith testified at the nursing board hearing, walking through the investigation he'd conducted, the multiple cameras he'd installed, the moment he'd realized the person stealing from his mother wasn't a random staff member, but his wife's sister. The prosecutor offered Stephanie a plea deal in March, plead guilty to all charges in exchange for 12 years in prison with possibility of parole after 8. Stephanie rejected it, insisting she'd be acquitted at trial. Her lawyer tried to build a defense around the idea that Stephanie had believed she was taking items families were discarding, that there'd been miscommunication about what she was authorized to remove from patients' homes. That defense collapsed when prosecutors presented testimony from victims' families, explicitly stating they'd never authorized Stephanie to take anything. The trial began in May. I attended every day, still trying to understand how I'd lived with someone capable of this level of systematic cruelty. The prosecution called victim after victim, family members describing their loved ones' confusion and distress when cherished possessions went missing. They called staff members from various facilities who testified about Stephanie's unusual interest in what patients owned, her habit of visiting them outside scheduled appointments, her tendency to isolate herself with patients away from cameras. They showed the security footage Keith had collected, and the jury watched in visible disgust as Stephanie methodically robbed people who trusted her. The defense called character witnesses who described Stephanie as caring and dedicated, but their testimony felt hollow against the weight of video evidence. Stephanie testified in her own defense, claiming the videos were edited to look incriminating, that she'd been given permission to take items by confused patients who later forgot. The prosecutor destroyed her on cross-examination, presenting records showing Stephanie had sold specific stolen items within days of taking them, that she'd researched pawn shops and jewelry buyers, that her bank deposits aligned exactly with dates she'd worked at homes where thefts were reported. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all 58 counts charged. 58 counts of theft from vulnerable adults, 18 counts of elder abuse, and multiple counts of fraud. The judge scheduled sentencing for 2 months later, allowing time for victim impact statements. During that period, additional victims came forward, bringing the total to over 80 families affected by Stephanie's crimes. The sentencing hearing lasted an entire day as victim after victim, or their family members, addressed the court. Some were angry, demanding maximum sentences. Others were heartbroken, describing beloved relatives who died, never knowing what happened to their treasured possessions. One man in his 70s testified about his father, a World War II veteran who'd kept his Purple Heart and service medals in a case by his bed at the memory care facility. Stephanie had stolen them and sold them to a military memorabilia dealer for $800. The medals were eventually recovered, but his father had died believing he'd lost them, spending his final weeks confused and distressed. Another woman described her grandmother's engagement ring, a simple gold band with a small diamond that had been worn for 62 years. Her grandmother had dementia and couldn't articulate what was wrong. But she'd kept touching her ring finger where the ring had been, clearly aware something important was missing. She died 3 months later, still touching that finger. These weren't just thefts. They were violations of the most vulnerable people, systematic abuse of trust, exploitation of confusion, and memory loss. The judge's face was stone as he listened to impact statement after impact statement. When it was time for sentencing, he spoke at length about the nature of Stephanie's crimes, the calculated manner in which she'd targeted victims, the duration of the criminal enterprise, and her complete lack of remorse. "You were entrusted with the care of society's most vulnerable members," the judge said, looking directly at Stephanie. "People who could not defend themselves, who could not remember what happened to them, who relied on caregivers to act with integrity and compassion. Instead, you saw them as opportunities for profit. You systematically robbed them of their possessions, their dignity, and their peace of mind in their final years. This court finds your conduct among the most reprehensible it has encountered." He sentenced her to 32 years in prison, to be served consecutively across multiple counts. She'd be eligible for parole after 24 years, meaning she'd be in her 50s before she could even apply for release. Stephanie's face showed emotion for the first time, shock and panic replacing the cold calculation. She started to say something, but her lawyer grabbed her arm and whispered urgently. The bailiffs took her into custody immediately, and she was led out of the courtroom, finally crying, finally understanding the consequences of her actions. Robert and Patricia sat in the front row, Robert with his head in his hands, Patricia crying silently. They'd lost their daughter to her own choices, and nothing would bring back the person they'd thought she was. The civil suits continued for months after the criminal trial concluded. Victims' families sued Stephanie directly, obtaining judgments against her assets. The secret bank account was liquidated, with funds distributed proportionally to victims, though it covered only a fraction of what had been stolen. The house Robert and Patricia had mortgaged to post her bail went into foreclosure when they couldn't maintain payments on my father-in-law's reduced retirement income. They moved into a smaller apartment, selling most of their possessions, their social standing in the community destroyed by association with their daughter's crimes. Jeremy stopped speaking to Stephanie entirely, refusing to visit her in prison or accept her phone calls. He testified in some of the civil cases, providing information about family finances and Stephanie's behavior over the years that he'd previously minimized or ignored. My divorce finalized 8 months after Stephanie's arrest. The judge granted it on grounds of fraud and criminal activity, with no spousal support and no division of assets, since everything Stephanie had accumulated was proceeds of crime. I kept the house, which had been purchased entirely with my income, and our marriage was legally dissolved as if it had never existed. Keith and Vanessa's relationship with the rest of the family remained complicated. Some relatives thanked Keith for exposing the truth, others blamed him for destroying the family by going public at Christmas dinner instead of handling it privately. Keith stood by his decision, arguing that Stephanie had proven through her threats that private confrontation wouldn't work, that she'd have continued stealing and hurting people if not forced to stop publicly. I reached out to Keith several months after the sentencing, meeting him for coffee to thank him properly. I told him I understood why he'd done what he did the way he did it, that having everyone see the evidence simultaneously prevented Stephanie from creating different narratives for different people. He appreciated it, but looked exhausted, like the whole ordeal had aged him several years. "I keep thinking about all the people we didn't identify," he said. "All the victims who died before anyone realized what happened. Families who never knew why grandmother's jewelry disappeared or grandfather's coin collection vanished. Stephanie got 32 years, but it doesn't undo what she took from people who can't be restored." I'd thought about that too, about the permanence of what Stephanie had done, how even with justice served, the damage remained. I eventually started dating again, tentatively, explaining my history to anyone who seemed interested in something serious. Most people were understanding, recognizing I'd been a victim of Stephanie's deception as much as anyone. I met someone through a teaching colleague, a woman named Amy, who worked as a social worker with elderly clients. She understood the dynamics of elder abuse in ways most people didn't, the systematic nature of it, the targeting of vulnerable populations. We bonded over shared values about protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. 2 years after Stephanie's conviction, I testified at a state legislative hearing about reforms to home health care oversight. I described my experience discovering my wife's crimes, the warning signs I'd missed, the systemic failures that had allowed her to operate for years. The legislature eventually passed new requirements for background checks, mandatory reporting of suspicious incidents, and random monitoring of home healthcare workers. Small changes, but possibly enough to prevent the next Stephanie from operating so freely. Mrs. Whitmore, Keith's mother, passed away 3 years after Stephanie's arrest. Her dementia had progressed to the point where she no longer recognized anyone. But Keith had gotten back most of the jewelry Stephanie had stolen, and he made sure his mother was buried wearing her wedding ring. He said it mattered, even though she didn't know it anymore, that she had it back where it belonged. I still teach middle school, finding purpose in shaping young people's understanding of ethics and integrity. I use my experience as a cautionary tale in discussions about character and choices, about how people aren't always who they appear to be, about the importance of questioning rather than blindly trusting. My students don't know the details of my personal story, but they benefit from the hard-earned lessons it taught me. Daniel and I maintain contact, having formed a strange bond through shared trauma of being connected to Stephanie's crimes. On Christmas, I spend it with Amy's family now, grateful for the normalcy of their gatherings. 4 years after that Christmas dinner when Keith showed the security footage, I can finally participate in holiday celebrations without the weight of dread. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.